Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We have a panel this morning to cover ESG, which is probably the most important, newest big factor to be discussed between both investors and principals of the REIT universe. This is a sector that we probably were not including on our list of topics 10 years ago, and now it's really become front and center. And with all that has occurred in our country in the past year, it's particularly important to me personally, and I'm thrilled to be part of this panel and thrilled to have the folks that we have today. It's really just a great group, and really we look forward to covering all aspects of ESG and how it's impacting the decisions being made at these companies. I thought that maybe Sherry would start with you because it feels like the investor demand for ESG has increased tremendously. And so you want to give us some of your thoughts on how you look at it and what demands you all have and what disclosures you all want to see.
Sure. So ESG obviously has grown in importance for investors, and the demand for it has increased. If you look at 2020, it was 100% increase in, industry-wide in ESG products. And the ESG dedicated products grew about 30%, whereas the whole industry only grew about 5%. So you can see it's outpacing, although it's a much smaller portion of the investment universe, it is outpacing the rest of the industry in growth. For real estate products specifically, we're seeing an increased demand, particularly out of Europe, as SDFR, sustainable financial reporting regulations were just put into effect this year. And so many clients are struggling with how do they meet something called Article 8. And so we're helping our clients by defining how they will meet that by ESG screens, and importantly, incorporating ESG factors into the security selection process. So we treat ESG as a risk like any other risk that should impact the value of each company. And so when I'm talking about risks, I mean asset risk, financial risk, management risk, and ESG risk. And so when we break that down, each of those components are important. But if you look at environmental, we're looking at, green building participation. When you look at the S, it's about human capital management. And that probably is the category that people have the hardest time understanding what's needed. And so we're going to look at things like employee retention, diversity of workforce, and equality of pay. And then the G is probably the best understood, right? We've all been concerned about governance for years, and it has to do with board composition, whether they are poison pills or not, things of that nature. So each of those have key performance indicators that get weighted and tallied up to be an ESG score that impacts the value of the company.
Thank you. Michael, shifting over to you, and I was curious, the ESG template, does that change what you are investing in?
Scott, good morning. I think it's certainly, I'd say a couple of things. One is it certainly affects how we manage our existing portfolio, right? We start with we've got a portfolio of about 26 million square feet. And so before we think about, how it affects or applying it to what we buy, is our current portfolio positioned effectively for, the world that we've transitioned into? Is our portfolio sustainable? Is our company set up from a governance standpoint to meet, to be high in terms of check marks, as Sherry referenced, and then from a social standpoint. So, I would say really going back more than a decade, sustainability has been an important dynamic and focus for us at a senior management level. We viewed it as something that was going to move from a nice to have to a need to have. And so we very quickly focused on having our portfolio be sustainable. Our 95% is LEED Gold or better. We've consistently been recognized for our leadership with a number of different awards. Our energy usage is down probably 25% since we started testing in 2009. So it starts in the existing portfolio. And then in terms of new, it's both development and acquisition. I would say on the development side, everything we're doing now, which particularly is our Penn Station redevelopment efforts, where we have about 5.5 million square feet under development. Everything is, has the ESG lens on it. So, the types of materials we're using, the types of, from a air quality, from a water flow standpoint, we're doing things in terms of some of the existing development, like electrifying the buildings fully, doing triple glaze glass in order to reduce energy consumption. So everything we're doing, and those are proactive decisions. If you said we have done that, 3 or 5 years ago, I don't know that we would have, but and they may not have an immediate payoff, but we think over time it's going to make those buildings more competitive. It's going to align our our performance with our objectives that we've set out. And then clearly, as we look forward to new acquisitions as well, I would say we focus on assets where we think the opportunity is there to achieve, we want to from a sustainability standpoint. So if an asset is just functionally obsolescent and, the infrastructure is not there to allow us to achieve that, I think that asset's going to underperform going forward. So it clearly affects both existing and new assets we look at.
Great, thank you. Jim, let's focus a little bit on the S, with the idea that the E and the G, they're quantifiable, or specific targets. S feels a little more challenging for folks to quantify. What are you all doing about that?
Well, I think look, maybe I could take a step back, Scott, and just reflect a bit on something Sherry said, which is, from an investor standpoint, when you view a company through the ESG lens, one of the things you're thinking about is risk. What types of risks that company might present from an environmental, social, or governance perspective. And, certainly to maybe follow on what Michael was saying, we have very specific goals in each of those categories, certainly from an environmental and sustainability standpoint, in terms of energy consumption, in terms of renewable energy, in terms of upgrading properties to be more efficient. And the reason that we're focused on that, just as Michael articulated, is it's just better business. To be more sustainable, to reduce emissions, not only reduces risks, but as we implement those sustainability measures, we get very measurable and demonstrable returns on the capital that we're putting to work. And I think that that's important. On the social side, we're looking at it a number of ways. I mean, I think, our primary objective as a company is to make sure that we attract and retain the very best talent. So we need to make sure that we're being inclusive, that we're creating an environment that embraces a diversity of perspectives and backgrounds, simply because it makes us better. And we can measure that through employee engagement surveys, as Sherry mentioned. Also, retention is very important, as well as diversity. And it's something that we put out in our corporate responsibility report, and we measure. And, I think it makes us better as a company. That's why we're doing it. It's not something that we're doing because we should. It's something that we look at and say, if we have better talent, we will do better as a company. If our employees are more engaged, we'll do better as a company. If we embrace a diversity of backgrounds and perspectives, we're going to make better decisions as a company. And finally, from a governance standpoint, as Sherry mentioned, those are all things that have been embraced for some time now in terms of the independence of the board, the separation of the chairman and the CEO role, diversity on the board itself. As we were talking about in our pre-call, we're not doing those things because we should. We're doing those things because it makes us a better company. And to Sherry's point, on the investor side, we believe it reduces the risk of our overall efforts.
Oh, Jim, to stay with that for a second, in terms of sourcing employees, what have you been able to do to try to get in a broader universe of folks?
It's been a real focus of ours. One of the things we've realized is that you need to provide opportunities early through internship programs. And certainly our recruiting efforts are directed at institutions that allow us to promote and grow our diversity. But those early employment opportunities, I think, are some of the most powerful ways to bring in people into the organization from a diversity of backgrounds and perspectives. And we have great success in hiring from that internship program. I think our conversion rate is over 3/4. It gives folks who may not necessarily understand our business an opportunity to come in and see what it is we do, how we execute on our plan, and also what our culture is. So that's been, I think, the most productive way that we've been bringing diversity to our organization, as well as creating an environment and a culture that embraces it. And I think word of mouth in terms of what is it like to work for Brixmor is another way that we can continue to promote that and grow that.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Ben, you stepped into an organization that I assume had an ESG framework in place, but curious, have there been changes that you've wanted to make, or had that whole construct fit with your vision?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. AvalonBay has been a fairly established leader in the arena of ESG, and it is definitely part of what excites me about being here and helping us stay on the forefront of those efforts. As I think about the steps that they've taken, one, being very forthright in terms of we will be a better organization through the implementation and tracking and reporting and improvement across each of the different areas, setting numeric goals over specific timeframes, and then tracking ourselves and reporting against those goals. Right, if you want to initiate and see real change across really any arena, and the same is true within ESG. And so, in a couple of areas, I'll hit on. So on the environmental side, about 18 months ago, AvalonBay came out with science-based targets for the reduction of emissions, and more specifically, putting out a numeric goal of reducing our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions by 50% by 2030. So an example of putting out specific steps and then allowing us to then implement, set our business plans, allocate resources, and track ourselves against those goals. And similarly, mid last year, we set numeric goals more on the social side, and specifically around inclusion and diversity, of increasing our representation of women in the leadership level, taking that number from about 35% into the low 40% over the next 5 years, and a similar metric on underrepresented minorities, increasing our representation there in leadership from 15% to 20% by 2025, and then another 5% by 2030. So part of my effort and activity is, now we've set those goals, is how do I work with each of the business leaders and make it very much a key part of setting business planning for each of those units as we look forward in this year and over the next couple of years.
Great, thank you. And Ed, in a sense, you had the opposite situation from Avalon, where you started out with a blank slate when VICI was created. Can you tell us about how you built out your plan?
Yeah, Scott, thanks. We did. We started with a blank slate back in 2017. I originally came in, hired by a creditor group that was headed by the likes of Elliott and PIMCO, Monarch Alternative, and JP Morgan Asset Management. And to anyone who's listening to this who thinks, God, I think I'd really like to take my company private, because then I wouldn't have to deal with all this ESG stuff. You would be going from the frying pan into the fire, because your owners at that point are likely to be GPs on behalf of LPs who are really, really serious about E, S, and G, whether they be pension funds or endowments. The proliferation of this movement, which is the right proliferation, extends all through the global sources of capital. And so with that blank sheet of paper, we committed to all of the right governance practices, including, as Sherry invoked a moment ago, anything having to do with making it tougher either to take over the company or otherwise hold management to account. We very quickly grew a board that, fairly rare among REITs, is 50% men, 50% women among the independent directors. And then when it came to the E and the S, that is work, obviously, as a triple net REIT, we had to be thoughtful about, because it's not work we can do that's built into the fabric of how we manage our buildings, because we don't, frankly, manage our buildings. Our buildings are occupied by tenants who are responsible for every single aspect of that. But what we have focused on is making sure we have, for both the E and the S, practices that recognize our realities and limitations, but also give as much support to our tenants as we can. So on the E side of things, for instance, we've created an environmental investment fund that our tenants can tap in order to undertake building initiatives that will enhance the environmental management of the business. And on the S side, similarly, we are ready and willing to make capital available, including for things like, and these for me are very much part of the S, are things like employee locker rooms and employee cafeterias. Our view is that employees are very key to the whole S dimension of this. And I do think that one of the ways to tell how serious a company is to basically check the employee cafeteria, the employee locker room, if there are such facilities, because it says so much about how the company cares for its employees. The one last thing, though, I want to close out on is that we are all real estate companies. Jim and Ben and Michael and myself, we all run real estate companies. And what real estate companies are place makers and place sustainers. And I don't know that as an industry, we've come around to helping everyone understand, whether it be the investment community or the communities we serve, that when we do our jobs right, we create and sustain places that enhance people's lives. And I don't mean to speak for him, but Michael and his team for the last many years have been working on a project in the Farley building across from the quote old Penn Station that is going to be an enormously positive development for anyone who visits or lives or works in New York, right? And that is the most valuable thing, I think, that real estate companies do when it comes, especially to the S, is that the great places created by great real estate companies enhance people's lives, the people who work there and the people who either visit there, shop there, whatever they may do there, to pass through in transit. And I do think that as an industry, we probably don't celebrate well enough the great work done by the great real estate companies to enhance the social lives of our communities through the making of great places.
Terrific. Thank you. Sherry, I wanted to ask you about the difference that you see or don't see between your clients, your investors in Europe versus the US. It felt to me that Europe was ahead of us on all of this. Do you see that?
Absolutely. So, I mean, they actually have regulations that have just come out that require companies to disclose, financially, ESG metrics. And so that in and of itself is forcing the investor base to be more sophisticated about their investment in regard to ESG. In the US, there's a lot of controversy about, is it aligned with getting the best performance for clients? And so you've even had lawsuits where, someone thought that an ESG part of the mandate took away from the total return. And so it's not 100% clear across client bases who, what the right objective is for your client base. So I think ultimately, sustainability, as we've been talking about, is a risk like any other, and it's going to be embedded. It's not going to be about investing in ESG for the sake of good. It's going to be about investing in sustainability for the long-term benefit of the company, which ultimately should be related to performance. It's going to take a while before that gets sorted out and investors really understand what is material and related to performance for each of the ESG factors. And so, there will always be impact funds, which are different, right? Impact funds are people trying to make a change through investment. And so if you sign up for that, you're signing up for something totally different. But I think that sustainability is really ultimately just going to be part of investing, because it makes, as Jim was talking about, good business sense to do it in the long term. It's not just about doing what you think is right or what you think your investors think is right. It's about doing something that ultimately enhances the value of your company because you have a long-term risk perspective. So I hope that answered your question.
No, thank you. Great. Next question really for Jim, but all the public CEOs. Have you ever felt that there was an investor that you saw on a road show or during a conference who would sell your shares if you weren't where you needed to be on ESG, or who told you directly that they would sell your shares? Jim, you want to start that?
I've never had that experience. I think in part it's because we've embraced these principles as how we want to operate as a platform. To Ben's point, we've created very measurable goals, and we're very transparent about how we're achieving or meeting those goals. And to Sherry's point, I think it makes us a better company both in the near and long term as we embrace these principles that are consistent with our purpose as a company. Ed mentioned it. Our purpose as a company is to be the center of the community we serve. Our shopping centers, when they are really humming, they're not owned by Brixmor. They're owned, if you will, by the community that uses them. And we're real proud of that when we meet our objectives. And, to Sherry's other point, perhaps one of the more cogent discussions I've had with an investor around ESG is from an investor's perspective that fails to embrace these principles creates a bigger risk, whether it's environmental risk, whether it's social risk, whether it's governance. And so I think for us, it's consistent with our purpose as a company and something that we're very focused on continual improvement, right? It's not each of these principles, if you think about them, aren't points of arrival, they're a direction. How do you continue to grow and improve and measure yourself and hold yourself accountable? And I know with Michael and Ben that's how we drive our teams, right? We set clear goals and then we measure our progress towards them. So I've never had an investor say, if you don't do this, we won't invest in you. But I have had a number of conversations with very thoughtful investors about the consequences to platforms of not embracing these principles and what it means in terms of how they assess the risk of that particular enterprise.
Scott, I would add to Jim's comments. I think first, as I think about it on the governance side, I think that's where the focus probably came from investors early on, where, if your board wasn't diverse, you didn't have the right structures, whether it's not having poison pills or staggered boards or whatnot. I think there's a lot of early focus, which I think, the REIT sector, I think by and large is well ahead of other sectors and gets a lot of scrutiny, despite the fact you still have tech companies with, super majority control, and doesn't seem to stop any of the ESG funds or others from investing in them. So it's a little bit of hypocrisy in my mind on that. But that being said, I think governance was the early focus. I think on the sustainability side, I think we generally are hearing more from investors. We do shareholder outreach calls every year, and just finished this season and get quite a bit of plaudits in terms of our performance. But very clearly, I think this year is different from prior years. Some of the investor feedback is beginning to, if you don't do these things, it's going to start impacting, fund flows to those companies. So I think, as Jim said, I think it's a, from a business risk standpoint, and I think sustainability may be the most significant way you can measure business risk, because I think everybody's aware of the risk of climate change and what happens in terms of, lack of resiliency, et cetera. And so I think they want to see companies very much, taking steps to mitigate that and doing our part. And so I think capital will either flow to those companies that continue to be doing their part, or away from those companies that are not doing their part. And I don't know, I don't think we've evolved enough yet to know, what are those on and off points. I don't think any of us, are sort of at risk of being on the off. But, for funds, if you are doing some things, that may be sufficient for the ESG funds to invest capital in those companies. Ultimately, they're chasing returns, not just ESG metrics. But I think that, capital is going to increasingly focus on what are companies doing on all three phases, because it does make you a better company. It does mitigate risk. And so I think, again, you're going to hear more and more of that as we go year by year now.
Ben?
A couple things we're seeing. I'd say in terms of direct interaction with shareholders, and particularly the larger institutional shareholders, we got time with them. It's not just their fund managers, their real estate fund managers that are participating now. Often they also have their head of ESG. Sometimes that's the head of an ESG fund. Sometimes it's the head of ESG, and we're dedicating specific time and talking to our progress in that arena. We're also creating direct lines of communication with our head of corporate responsibility in those shops, like we would do in other arenas, to talk about best practices and their recommendations and how do we think about staying on the forefront. The other piece that we started talking more specifically to shareholders about this year is risk assessment. And so the team here in this past year went through a very detailed process with a third party, evaluating and scoring every asset in the portfolio for its risk as it relates to both emissions and climate risk. And so now we're able to quantify for investors the level of our portfolio that has certain degrees of risk. And then internally, we're able to set plans in terms of how to address those. And you asked a question before, which we are also hearing about from investors more, which is how do we think about particularly sustainability and environmental and new investment allocations. And so we're taking the learnings from the resiliency and risks process that we went through, and how now have actually added those into our underwriting process, and how we think about the appropriate risk and return for go forward new capital investment.
Ed?
Yeah, so Scott, let me actually focus on something I'm surprised we don't get asked about more often. And that to me is the fundamental foundation of the S in ESG, and that's employee engagement and morale. I would say most of the asset managers that we speak with, I even believe most of the asset managers are honest. I don't know if I've ever been asked about it, to be honest with you, which I find really puzzling. Because if I were an investor, and I were looking to invest in a company truly for the long term, I would want to know, is this company built on a cultural foundation that I can count on? Does it employ the right people doing the right work in the right ways? And, I think particularly in real estate, there have been cases where, you've got shops that pride themselves on being relentlessly tough, right? A eat what you kill culture. And if you can't cut it here, get out of here, right? And I think we've seen over time that that's not the way, especially in today's climate, you attract and retain great young talent, great talent, period. And women generally being smarter than men in so many different respects. That is definitely not a culture that tends to attract a lot of women either. So again, I do think it can and should be a bigger focus. Even though we're only 3.5 years old, the first full year we were in business, we entered into the whole Great Places to Work process in order to determine what kind of culture were we building right out of the gate. And we're very proud of the fact that we immediately got designated a great place to work, but we will hold ourselves to account every year going forward to make sure we don't lose that. And it's not about, it's not like being a tech startup where you just lavish money on people in all kinds of ways to make them happy and then watch the whole, the balance sheet and the P&L go to hell in a handbasket. This is about running the business via a balanced scorecard. But to me, that can and should be a bigger focus of ESG. And frankly, I would tell you in a lot of the asset management shops we walk into, they should be paying more attention to employee engagement and morale. Because we can tell when the investors we're dealing with work in a place that is not a great place to work, right? And frankly, at the end of the day, we want to be owned by places that are great places to work because they're likely to be better long-term shareholders.
If I could just jump in, I have to agree that the employment or employee opinion survey should be a critical part of any company's S policies, and investors should be asking about it. And maybe I better have a conversation with our team. But the other thing I think that's really important about employee retention is that I agree wholeheartedly that we need to be recruiting from the bottom up, a diverse set of employees, but they also need role models at the top. And so, investors like BlackRock and State Street have required diversity on boards, but we haven't required anything at the senior management level or even as the employee base as a whole. But I really think that the recruitment effort at the senior levels for diverse candidates needs to be upped, to say the least. I think that if you want to retain the really talented, diverse candidates, then they need to see that there's a path and a path towards the top. And in order to accomplish that, we're going to have more diverse C-suites. I mean, it's not this panel that we're on right now, right? There's 6 of us. And there's me, right? I'm the only female. I don't see any people of color. And, this is typical, right? This is typical, not just of real estate, but of asset management too. And, until there's more diverse faces at the top, I think we're going to be challenged to keep the people. So just a thought.
Well, circling
Very-
back, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it's such an important fundamental point. You can measure diversity in many ways, but it's important that it be embraced throughout the organization. And I'm real proud of where we stand as a company in terms of the diversity of our senior ranks and really all through the organization. But, it gets back to me to the fundamental question of why. Why is it so important? And, from my perspective, our first cultural tenet is that great real estate matters, but great people matter far more. And you can have a great person working on a mediocre piece of real estate get to a great result. On the flip side, you can have a mediocre person working on a great piece of real estate and you'll get to a mediocre result. And so when you have that as the underpinning of your culture, you're going to promote a diversity of perspective. Hopefully you're promoting an environment that's inclusive. Hopefully you're, unlike what we have here on the screen, you have a team of folks who also represent diversity of backgrounds and perspectives and et cetera. It's absolutely critical. But I think at the end of the day, what it drives is better outcomes and performance. And when you have an environment that attracts a diversity of perspectives and the very best talent, and truly you will get to better outcomes because you've got a culture that's built on that solid foundation, a culture that is based in trust, and a culture that promotes a diversity of perspective, importantly, so that you don't get into that corporate behavior of the lowest common denominator, that you create an environment where people can disagree, but disagree in a way that's constructive because you nurtured that type of diversity and difference. So it's interesting. I think over time, if you truly embrace that, you get better outcomes and you get better performance. And ultimately, it shows through in terms of results.
Circling back to my question around, have you heard someone say they were selling their shares because of ESG? I was told by someone on the buy side that, well, it might not be the first item that we look at when we make a buy-sell decision, but it's added into the mix. And so if we see a management team that hasn't been great on capital allocation or on their level of disclosure with us, and then, by the way, they're not so great ESG, that adds in to the mix and that'll lead us to a sale decision. I keep wanting to go back to the quantifiable or difficulty in quantifying some of this. The G is easy. I think probably the S feels the toughest, but I have always been struck by that typical slide that you see at the end of the slide deck that checks the boxes on ESG. And it's almost as if in some places they just grab someone else's they like, they change the logo on top and slap it in. It became very generic over time. It feels like that is starting to change. Sherry, are you seeing differentiation in what companies are looking for and ways that they are attempting to quantify it?
Yes. And so, there are a set of KPIs, key performance indicators, that if you look at, for example, GRESB for real estate is considered one of the go-to sources, right? So if you look at that and you look at the KPIs that they require companies to report on, that's a good starting point. And so we start with a similar set of KPIs and we weight them according to what we think is most important. And we've covered a lot of them so far. For that intangible S, we try and make it tangible by looking at things like employee retention, diversity numbers, equality of pay numbers, in order to assess companies across the board. We then weight all of these KPIs and then aggregate them up to an ESG score. You can go out and buy ESG scores from index providers, for example. The issue with that is they're using a generic scoring system across all industries that, in my opinion, for real estate should be different, right? As Ed said, we are creating people places, and that should have a different set of criteria than, a coal mining company, for example. So what is important to real estate is unique. And so we pick the factors that are unique to real estate. We aggregate them up and we score the company with a bespoke scoring. But the reality is companies have to deal with the fact that they're being scored without their input. Okay. This is like a data scrape. So if you have a corporate sustainability report, you need to be aware of what index providers like MSCI, for example, are scraping from your website and your sustainability report in order to create a score on your company, and then go back and make sure, oh, I didn't report on that, so I got 0. Let me go and adjust my sustainability report. Let me make sure that data is easily available. And I think that's something that companies more and more are becoming familiar with and trying to address. I mean, years ago, a lot of companies didn't even have a corporate sustainability report, and the numbers are growing. But it needs to be out there, and you really need to assess what data is being pulled from it, because it's not just being pulled by people like me who might understand that net lease has different issues than apartment buildings. So,
Ed, you want to jump in on that?
Which particular part of that, Scott?
Oh,
The net
just-
part of it?
I'm sorry?
I just want to make sure which part of that you wanted me to focus on.
So what are you seeing or what are you hearing from investors in terms of wanting to see you quantify your ESG more?
Yeah, quite a bit. And again, it goes back to the key point Sherry is making, which is the process of helping to understand the investor understand the true nature of the business we're in, whether it be our lease model, whether it be the nature of our assets, relationship to the community, to help them understand the metrics that are truly more relevant, right? And it's going to be a really iterative process because, first of all, we're dealing with different measuring organizations. There's MSCI, there's ISS. So, you know, we, at the end of the day, we would rather focus down on a few key metrics that we think really matter. And what we're actually probably more hesitant about is metric proliferation, where the metrics get so broad and maybe so borderline relevant that you get what you really can't afford to get in discussions like this, which is cynicism, right? Oh, okay, I get it. I got to tick that box, right? And I think that is really damaging, not only in terms of the sincerity with which you approach your own ESG programs, but the message it sends to the people who work for you. And I would just reiterate a good point that Jim made a moment ago, which is that these issues for senior management, for old guys like us, that can at times seem like, oh gosh, so I really have to pay a lot of attention to this. Can't we just make money? For our younger staff, our younger managers, this is sincerely important. And so you want to avoid creating a system that gets so bureaucratic and borderline silly that again, that cynicism arises, because that would be truly damaging.
You know, Sherry, you made the interesting point that a lot of these services that rate companies on ESG do so through scraping websites for certain keywords. And you could argue if you just dump enough of those keywords in your websites and throughout your materials that you could get a good score, rather than there being a true, to Ed's point, a true fundamental commitment to the principles that underlie these various areas. And, you know, I think it's incumbent upon us as leaders to continue to talk about these important principles and how they're driving our businesses forward, how they're consistent with our strategies as a company. Whether, as Ed said, it's making places, embracing the communities that you're serving, driving to better decisions, better performance. And I think in some respects, we're early days in this, but I do think that the companies who truly fundamentally embrace these principles will be better companies down the road, and that their performance will be better. It's not simply something that gets scraped off your website and you score something pursuant to those metrics or those keywords, but that you're truly better as a company, driven better performance.
And I think that was the impetus behind the SFDRs in Europe. So they wanted to create a regulation that specified what financial disclosures regarding sustainability needed to be provided, because they're trying to avoid greenwashing, right? The making your company appear to be sustainable when it's really not. And what we found with MiFID II is that regulation in Europe ultimately does spread and affect the globe, not the least because asset managers are global, and we invest in real estate companies in Europe and bring those practices over to how we invest in companies in the US. So I think we're going to see more clarity on that as we go forward.
Ben, I want to shift to training for a second. Wall Street firms have very detailed quarterly training on a whole host of issues. You have a broad team, geographically spread out. What do you do to train on some of these issues across your team?
Yeah, it's a very active effort, and it is up and down the organization, from corporate down to the community level as well. There's, I think, what we'd all see as sort of typical processes that are in place. We have done unconscious bias training down through all of leadership in the organization. That was a step that the team took last year. A couple other areas that we're focused on, some training related and some implementation kind of down into our teams. One is around diverse interview panels. And so working as we're interviewing really anybody in the organization, that they're seeing a diverse group of people across the table from them, partially from an inclusion perspective, but partially by us having diverse views of the table, we feel we'll make better decisions about the type of people that we hire and look for in future leadership. We're also just launched a mentorship program, and part of it, particularly as we think about people development, our ability to get a more diverse set of leaders up into the organization. Sponsorship and mentorship are key in that. And so our initial program, we're launching with 200 people, 200 matches across the organization, and very much tied into our overall program around inclusion and diversity.
Great. Well, I think we are going to have to call it there. I think our time is up, but I very much appreciate you all taking time to catch up on this. The level of dialogue has just increased so dramatically over the past couple of years, and I do think we're seeing a positive result from it, and from people no longer being able to simply check the box, but actually have to dig in and come up with real answers on ways to improve all three aspects here. So thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us about it, and folks in the audience, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.